Okay. Now, is everyone hearing okay? I'm assuming yes.
A good way to indicate that is to click your hand raising icon.
Okay.
So if you want to ask for feedback like that.
Okay, so I'm not hearing anybody's. Is anyone raising their hand? Okay, Maria, I hear you. Yep. Stacy, Teresa, I've got yours. PJ. Ron. No. And Takashi. Okay. So we are honored to have Kemi Jona present for us today. He is from Northwestern University and is an expert in STEM curriculum design, and particularly with online and blended learning. So I think that what he has for us today is going to be fascinating and obviously applicable to our current initiatives. And I do need to mention that the webinar was funded by the U.S. Department of Labor's Employment and Training Administration as part of the CHIO grant. So, Kemi, I would be delighted if you would like to start.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jenny, and thanks to Sue as well for inviting me to participate today. I can't really tell from the participant list how many people are dialed in via teleconference because it lumps everybody together. So what I think would be worth doing is if you have any questions along the way, either click the hand raise icon and either Jenny or I can call on you, or if you prefer, you can type your question, I think, into the chat room, if that's right, Jenny, and then either Jenny or I can notice it there, and then we can stop and try to address it. So hopefully that will be a good way to make this a bit more interactive. It's obviously really hard when we can't see each other, so we'll do the best we can. So today, the topic that was suggested that would be of most interest is to explore the experiences that students have in using simulations and remote labs, or remote, as we call remote web-based science labs, in physics or in other areas. And so the study that I think everyone received via email is a journal article in Distance Education that we published based on one of my students' dissertations along with my colleague David Utall a number of years ago, that really tried to understand how these different STEM learning technologies are perceived by students, both from a learning perspective, but just also from sort of a perception and engagement perspective, to understand if there were any really meaningful differences in how students thought about these experiences and whether they were supporting the kinds of learning goals that we have for students, both in K-12 as well as in undergraduate or graduate experiences. And if so, how might we best use those insights to share with other designers and developers as they were thinking about creating various online technologies to support learning. Let's see if I can get this right here. So I think a good place to start is to describe really briefly what remote labs are. And for those of you who aren't familiar with them, certainly most of us are familiar with the idea of simulations and models. A lot of times we've played with them online, but remote labs are a relative newcomer to the landscape, and it's important to understand exactly what they are. So this slide was actually supposed to be a video, which is obviously not going to play here, but I'll try to explain a version of it. This is an example of what a student would see using our remote lab platform called ilabcentral.org. And you're certainly welcome to visit it either now or after the webinar. What we have here is one of the first labs that we developed and that we also used in our study that I'll describe later, that allows students to run experiments on a Geiger counter that's located at the University of Queensland in Australia. And you can see a little picture of it. We'll show you a bigger picture in a minute of the lab itself. Actually, I'll switch to it right now. And what the student does is send over the design for the experiment, and then the instrument executes that experiment and sends the data back to the student. And so the idea then is that the student's experience is actually in controlling and getting data back from a real piece of equipment. And so that's really kind of the main difference between simulations or models and remote labs, is that in a remote lab you're actually getting data from a real piece of equipment somewhere. So let's look at some examples just to make this a little clearer of some different remote labs, or iLabs as we often call them. Here's one that we are putting online at Northwestern, is an X-ray powder diffraction iLab. And chemists and other material scientists use it to characterize or identify unknown crystalline substances or materials, and also to measure the sample purity. And then the data that you get back, as you can see over here on the lower left, looks like this data chart with different spikes at different degrees where the X-ray beam diffracts through the crystalline structure. And then by interpreting this graph, you can actually figure out what's in it. So that's one example that we're working on. Another one is one that we're doing in partnership with Thompson Rivers University. That is a water quality analyzer here that you can see. That one we're still working on. MIT has been working on this for many, many years. One of the first devices they put up was a microelectronics iLab that allowed you to sort of design different circuits, as you see on the left, and then test their characteristics remotely, but it was all running on the device that you see on the right side there. MIT also created another interesting one that looked at electromagnetism, and so you could have a magnet move up and down through a magnetic field, and it would actually draw the force lines that you can see over here on the upper right, and the students can sort of control that and try to graph the results. Perhaps the coolest one of all that I know of is that MIT has a research nuclear reactor, and which you can see at the upper left. And they actually created a neutron beam remote lab because they were actually having trouble getting non-U.S. students into the facility, since it's controlled by the Atomic Energy Commission. And so this way they could run the lab safely and not have to actually gain admission to the building for non-U.S. citizens. And finally, one of the leaders in remote labs has been the University of Technology in Sydney. And what you're seeing here are those green beams as an engineering lab where you deflect the beam and measure the force of the deflection. and how far the beam deflects under a certain force. So it's sort of an intro engineering kind of lab. And you can see what they've done is they've actually built out 2 labs on each side of those carts, so 4 per cart. And you can see there's like at least 3 or 4 carts going off into the distance there. Each has little webcams so the students can watch on video. And so this is really the main way that the undergrads in that course access their labs is through these remote lab facilities. So before we dive into a discussion of the study that we did, I think it's good to step back and sort of take a big picture view. And many of you, if you're familiar with it, or those who are following the literature, know that there's often some very heated arguments about the relative merits and limitations of conventional or hands-on, sometimes as they're called, although that's a little bit of a misnomer. So I like to call them conventional labs, remote labs, and simulation-based labs. And Ma and Nickerson, in the reference at the bottom, had a really great sort of literature review. And I think this statement that you see here really captures kind of the current state of the field, even though it's coming up on 9 years old now, is that the debate is very much, it often feels like a religious debate rather than a scientific debate. And I think that that's because people often get confounded over what the educational goals or objectives are that they have for the labs, and they're measuring by different yardsticks. But also, and this sort of foreshadows our conversation in the study, they say that in fact it may be that the psychology of presence may be as important as the underlying technology. In fact, that's one of the things that we examine in our study. So let's try to unpack that a little bit. And I think in the Ma and Nickerson paper, they identified a range of different goals that one might have in exposing students to a lab experience, whether conventional or otherwise, technology mediated. And these are some of the different goals that they've identified, and certainly there may be others that you or your colleagues have. And it's very important as you work on this with them to really be clear on what those goals are. So, most labs have a goal of building some kind of conceptual understanding among the students. Others focus on design skills that are more sort of open-ended and really trying to design an experiment that identifies it or a solution. There's also obviously social or collaboration skills that might be important, team skills. And finally, at the bottom, there's this notion of what they call professional skills, which some people might refer to as sort of lab skills per se, just how to do various technical procedures and operations, either with lab equipment or specific materials. Sample preparation is often cited. So, each of these alone or in combination are, completely legitimate educational or learning goals, and it's just a matter of sorting out for your particular lab or a particular lab, which of these are foregrounded, which of them are backgrounded or absent, and does that match what you're trying to achieve with the students that you're serving. And so Ma and Nickerson also did kind of an interesting analysis. This may be a little bit hard to read, but basically they plotted those 4 different goals: design skills, social skills, conceptual understanding, and professional skills on these axes. And in the literature review, identified sort of different patterns that you can see of on the left here, hands-on labs, in the middle simulated labs, and on the right remote labs. And I think the interesting thing here is almost all 3 of them had very strong conceptual understanding goals, but they differ on how much, say, professional skills are key versus, say, social skills are very strong, say, in hands-on lab relative to, say, remote labs. And so whether these pictures are in fact completely accurate or just sort of indicative, I think it is a good image to keep in your mind that the particular configuration of goals might be quite different depending on what you're trying to do. And it's if you're going to compare, it's good to compare apples to apples as much as possible. Let me just pause there before we go on and see if there are any questions about any of this so far. So either raise your hand, and I guess Jenny can figure out how to allow you to talk, or type your question into the chat window if you have anything.
Okay, I think I've given everybody audio
Okay.
permission, so unless you're on mute, we should be able to hear you.
All right. Well, I guess we're good then.
Yeah.
Okay, well, good. Again, if anything comes to mind and you don't want to interrupt, just type it into the chat room, and we'll try to pick it up. Okay, so transitioning now over to a little bit deeper dive into the study that we did. You know, we wanted to again unpack, if you will, some of the more nuanced differences between remote labs and simulations, to kind of see where the various strengths and weaknesses are. Not because I think that the ultimate goal here is to crown a winner and declare one of the three kind of the king of the hill at the expense of the others, but to really better understand which format might lend itself best to a particular type of lab experience or phenomena or learning goal or age group, if you will. And so we wanted to really begin to understand some of those questions. And so the study that I'm going to talk about is the one that's referenced here. It was written by our student Megan Souter, who did finish her dissertation on this a number of years ago, along with my colleagues David Utah, David Raff, and Michael Downing, who was a senior undergraduate at the time. And so just to kind of set up the study that we did, here you can kind of see the four different conditions. So we used our Geiger counter lab that I showed you the screen of before, and we'll get back to that screen in a second. Normally when you do the remote lab, you also get to see a live webcam view of it running, and so you really can see the experiment running, and the Geiger counter moves up and down and measures radiation at different distances that you tell it to. And so especially the first time, it's pretty exciting for the students, the high school students that we tested it on, as well as the undergraduates. And so we looked at both remote labs, one that had the live webcam, and one where we replaced the live webcam with just a still photo, like a screen grab, what the webcam would show you, but it just obviously never moved. I'll show you that picture next. Then what we did is we kept the whole interface completely the same, totally identical, can't tell the difference, except what we did is instead of the students' experimental parameters going to the actual device in Australia, we sent it to a simulation that returned data that would look very much like what the instrument would return, including some random variability in the results that would mimic what the instrument would return, because obviously the instrument doesn't return a precise value every time, and so neither did our simulation. It kind of put a little noise in the system. So those are the four basic conditions: either remote lab with a picture, remote lab with a webcam, a simulation with a picture, or a simulation with a webcam. And so we're really asking two things. One is, what's the difference between the remote lab and the simulation? And the other is, how valuable is the live webcam, or equivalently in the simulation, a kind of a pre-recorded video clip of what the webcam would have showed you if you were using the remote lab. But either way, the video, the right column has the sort of live video or pre-recorded video. So the subjects were undergrads. Normally when we test these, we test them in classrooms, but because we needed to kind of control these conditions, we brought undergrads into the lab, and we had them do this, use this technology on a computer in our lab. And you can see we had mostly freshmen, and then some sophomores, juniors, and seniors. they averaged about one prior physics course total. And you can see the breakdown there. Some had none. Most, probably half or so had high school physics, and then about the other, whatever, 2/3 or so had either AP or college level physics. So fairly, reasonable experience in physics. Just so you can see what it looks like, this is the still photo that the students would see on their screen in place of the live webcam. But this is basically just a screenshot of the webcam itself. Over here on the left side is the Geiger counter tube, and it's on a little mechanism here that moves up and down. And then right here where this red dot is a little turntable that has some strontium-90 emitter on it, and that's what the Geiger counter will measure. And then also as the lab is going on, the Geiger counter moves up and down. This readout here on the left is the number of particle counts, and this on the right are sort of the number of elapsed seconds that the instrument has been on. So those are all moving around on the video, and actually they put this really old clock up here just to convince people it was really was a live experiment. And so the clock, the second hand moves and ticks and whatnot, even though it has nothing to do with the experiment. It's just kind of a cool little artifact. But so the picture would just stay as you see it exactly here for the photo condition, and then it would be either a recorded video of the lab running or the live lab itself in the other condition. Also, and I zoomed this up, it's a little hard to see on the earlier screen, but after the student designs their experiment, they choose, as you can see here, the distances that they want to measure, and they can choose as many as they want, what the measurement time is, how many seconds they want to take measurements, and then how many replication trials they want to run. Anywhere from 1 to, I think, 10 is the max. And so they get to design the experiment, and that's a very important part of this experience. And then when it sends it to the instrument then runs the experiment and then returns the data that you see down here below, or in the simulation condition, the simulation will return this data. But in either case, the screen looks exactly like this for the student. There's no difference whatsoever in what the student had to do to design the experiment or to see the data. And then they could also, later they would get some screens that showed, they had some graphs that they could use to analyze the data as well and determine what's called the inverse square law, which is that the intensity of the radiation decreases as a function of the square over the distance, which is a very common physics phenomenon. Works in light and sound and heat and other point source phenomena. So, so let's talk about what we found. Well, and so I apologize, it's a little bit dense, but again, stop if there's any questions along the way. So one of the first questions we had is that sense of presence that Mon Nickerson mentioned. That feeling, and you probably felt it yourself, that if you're watching a movie in a movie theater, once the previews go off and you're watching Bilbo and Gandalf on in The Hobbit or something, you sort of forget that you're in the movie theater and you become absorbed in the presence or the experience of it. The same thing if you're absorbed in a novel, or video gamers also report this feeling of really being present in the experience. And so we queried the subjects after they were finished with the lab about their experience, and they reported that they felt that it was much more like a real lab. They believed that they had done a quote-unquote real experiment when they did the remote lab, a lot more than the simulation users did. This is a significant finding. And also the simulation users who saw that video clip as opposed to the photo felt more like they completed an experiment than did those users, again, with just the photo. So we see that even when you're using, the remote lab was the most strongly believed, but even when you're using a simulation, it felt more real if you could provide some video of what what that lab was simulating. So that was sort of an interesting finding with respect to the value of the video or the webcam. One of the other questions we had was, was there any preference one way or the other for the different types of labs? What did the students or the subjects themselves prefer? And as you can see, the participants strongly prefer the remote lab over the simulation, regardless of which one they had actually done. And they knew which one. We didn't try to trick them. A lot of people will say, like, did you lie to them and tell them that they were using a remote lab when it was really a simulation, vice versa? In this case, we didn't try to do any deception. We told them honestly which one they were doing. And so they knew, and we asked both groups which one that they would prefer, and virtually all of them leaned towards the remote lab, especially if they had done the remote lab, but even so. And very few remote lab users said that they would have preferred the simulation. And that did not vary whether they had the photo or the video at all. So that didn't affect the preference. And so what that tells us is that the lab type exerted a greater influence on their lab preferences than the visual features of the experience did. So that was kind of an interesting takeaway for us, that the nature of the lab itself, you couldn't really conceal that with some fancy window dressing like some videos. So that was cool. We also, one of the things that we care deeply about, and most of us do when we're designing learning technologies, is the kinds of scientific thinking skills or scientific practices that we're really trying to evoke in our students, especially younger students, say in middle school and high school, but even introductory students who may not have a deep experience with science. And we were looking to see what the different lab experiences evoked for them. And so we did find that remote lab users tended to, for example, expect variability in their data more often than simulation users did, which is good, because that's a really important thing that scientists understand, is that you can't just take one sample and expect that number to be accurate. You have to sample a number of times, or take a large sample of respondents, say, in a survey, in order to really feel confident that the data that you're getting is accurate. We also saw that remote lab users were more likely to want to run the lab again, which is certainly another kind of scientific practice that we would like to instill in our students, that you can't run something once and feel really good about it. You've got to repeat it a few times in order to really get confident that you've got quality results. We saw that the remote users who saw the video were more likely to want to rerun the lab as compared to users who saw photos. So the video, that live video, really reinforced that sense of, hey, this is cool, but maybe I should run it again and get more data. And we did not find that with simulation users. The video versus the photo did not have any effect whatsoever on the likelihood of wanting to run it again. And some of the reasons when we asked them for wanting to run the lab again included a desire to, say, confirm or replicate the original data, or maybe to try different settings, different parameters for their experiment, different methods. And certainly those are all kinds of outcomes that I think we would hope to be instilling as a result of lab experiences for our students. So we were very gratified to see those kinds of outcomes. We also found that participants wrote higher quality research questions when they were using the remote lab. We asked them to actually write down in the interface what their research questions were. And we also saw that the video did help also increase the quality of the questions as opposed to the photo. Again, no such effect in the simulation. So again, we keep uncovering these interesting differences between the two, and also between the combination of lab type and video versus photo. So some of the implications here, we think what's going on is that the remote lab users were more invested in the actual experiment, that they crafted better research questions, considered how their experiment might limit the error, evaluated different sources of variability, and so and also that the video seemed to really help that engagement with the task. Of course, a key question that we always get asked is, was there any difference in learning outcomes? That's often one of the key questions. And we did see some differences in terms of the conceptual learning goals. The remote group, within the remote group, those participants who saw the video did a better job of explaining the relationship between distance and intensity of radiation than those who only saw a photo. And we did not see that same effect in the simulation user. So again, having that live video of the remote lab seemed to be kind of the sweet spot to really have the best impact on that. And we think that by viewing the video, the participants did see the relationship between the distance and radiation. As the Geiger counter moved away from the source, the particle counts would decrease. So we think that that was an important part of helping grow learners' understanding. So I think we covered this. One thing we did not find is we did not see any significant differences between the quality of the experimental designs between these two conditions. And that's something that we did, really make as a core piece of our lab here. So at least in that case, both simulations and remote labs supported it. One thing I will say, and we'll take a little bit of a side trip here to a different study, an earlier study that we did with high school students, is we did find, in fact, that the more times that a student would run the lab, the better their experimental design quality was. And so for this particular lab, if you remember, there's three basic kinds of parameters: the number of distances that you choose to measure, the average measurement time at each distance, and the number of trials. And so if we look at how a student does between each one, we found across the board that in significant levels that they kept improving their experimental design each time. In a sense, that shouldn't be shocking, because we know that for most things, the more times you practice something, the better you get at it. But here we have hard data that shows us that repetition did really support higher quality learning for students. So in the main study that I was reporting, students didn't get a chance to run the lab multiple times. They only had one shot at it. So this is some evidence that we have from a different study that showed us that the remote lab really did foster better designs when given the opportunity to use it multiple times. In a third study that we did with Michael Downing, who is for his undergraduate thesis, another sort of tantalizing finding was we did see better retention at a 1-week follow-up for remote labs than simulations. So that would be the dark blue line in each year. So this is simulation after 1 week, and this is remote lab after 1 week. So there's something interesting about that feeling of engagement and presence that we think contributes to better retention, at least after a week. I mean, obviously we'd like to know, over longer terms, but for at least that amount of time, the information seemed to be sticking better. Another finding from our earlier study was that allowing sort of this flipped classroom or flipped laboratory idea, by letting students do the lab outside of class. Again, we couldn't do this in our main study because we were just bringing undergraduates into our lab here at Northwestern. But given the chance to work out of class when you could repeat, you had more time, you could do it at your own pace, we did see, again, higher quality experimental designs in the out-of-class group, we think because, again, you just had more chances to repeat and get better at it. So another reason we think that the desire to repeat the lab, to run the lab again that we documented actually will turn into better experimental design abilities through this mechanism. And finally, one question is, well, just saying, in our study we just asked them, would you want to run the lab again? We didn't actually have them do it. And so you could say, well, maybe they knew that, we were, evaluating them, so that of course they're going to want to say things that would impress us or make them look good. In this study that we did with the high school students, we found that students voluntarily ran more experiments than were required by their lab assignment when they were out of class than when they were in class. Almost 3 times more ran it, again, more times than they had to. So, so that there is some evidence that that the sparking the desire to do the lab actually does translate into actually doing it multiple times and getting better while they do it. So, coming up to the end here, what I would say, what are the big takeaways? What are the messages? Obviously, we've drilled into the weeds here pretty deeply, a lot of different questions and different statistical results. But I think some of the important points are these. First, that the difference between remote labs and simulations really did involve a lot of the student beliefs about the source of the data. Remote lab users are able to gather the data from real devices, and obviously simulation users don't. And it just didn't seem as realistic or authentic to them as working a real lab via a remote lab interface. And so even though those two lab experiences, the remote lab and simulation, looked identical on the screen, the remote lab's connection to a real device turned out to be integral to fostering an engaging and realistic lab experience for our participants. Moreover, what we think is going on is that the authenticity of the data was important because it encourages student engagement with the task. In other words, they had higher quality research questions. They wanted to run the lab again. And in fact, we saw in the other study that they did run the lab again more than they had to. And in fact, their experimental designs got better. So that was all good. And again, as I said, that running the lab multiple times does increase the design quality and research question quality. And that we, when given the chance, we do know that students will in fact run the lab more than is required. So this is kind of a rough sketch, and I wouldn't really put a stake in the ground on this completely, but I think that it is something that looks more or less, our logic model, if you will, would look something like this, that the authenticity, that feeling of authenticity leads to a deeper sense of engagement among the students, a deeper sense of ownership over the lab experience, over the ownership over the quality of the data that is produced, since the students know that it's their experimental design and they told the device what to do and they collected the data from the device. It was really their data. So that sense of ownership then, among other things, translates into a desire to run the lab again, or a desire to, as part of that, change some of the experimental designs or improve the experimental design. And so ultimately, that leads to an increase in the quality of the experimental design, the research questions, and a lot of those learning outcomes that really are core outcomes of a laboratory experience, independent of the specific content or skills of that lab. It's just a really solidifying a student's understanding of the scientific process and of the values of the scientific enterprise from an experimental perspective. So that's kind of the money shot picture here that I've been describing with our various results. And I think the data, at least for a couple of the studies, really is beginning to converge onto something like this, and also show us that remote labs and simulations both have definitely have their place in our toolbox as educators and science educators, especially in remote or online situations, but have different affordances for the student and for learning, both in terms of the mechanism of the lab, whether it be simulations or remote or, in fact, conventional hands-on labs, but as well as, you know, the importance of showing video clips or live webcams in terms of reinforcing some of those factors. So I think those are the important takeaways from this study, and that really kind of wraps up kind of the efforts you know, that we did on these pieces, and I'd be happy to stop here and open it up for some broader conversation. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kemi. That was really, really enjoyable. Do we have any questions from the group? Oh, good point, Maria. Do you have your, know what?
Make sure you have to click. You have to click talk if you're on the web, you know, on the website.
Right, top left corner. There's a button for talk and a button for video. So if you click talk, then we should be able to hear you. And also, okay, so Kemi, we have a question from PJ.
Yep, I see that. Thanks, PJ. In some of the webcams that we use, this one is not like that, but the folks at Thompson Rivers have a webcam that is user controllable, and you know, the students do enjoy sort of zooming around. You can actually zoom really pretty close into some of the instruments or look around the lab, and I think that that does add, you know, some excitement to the experience. You know, the problem, of course, is that it's only one webcam, and so whoever clicks on it gets to move it around, and so if there's more than one person clicking on it, you know, it can get a little bit jerky. But I think it is exciting for them, and it could be a positive addition depending on the type of lab that you're trying to do.
Anyone else have any questions?
While we're waiting to see if anybody else wants to type a question, I will say that you know, the website, the ilabcentral.org website, I'll type it into the chat room for you in case you missed it, is something that you can definitely access. Within a week or so, we'll be posting some links that also allow folks to customize the questions that students get asked around the lab itself. And so you could, for example, take the Geiger counter lab or one of the other ones and change the prompts and questions to make it fit your educational context, you know, without having to do any programming or anything like that. So we're adding some more powerful tools for sort of class management, so that, you know, instructor can assign a lab, provide feedback online to the lab, and get some interesting analytics aggregated across the lab group. So you could see, for example, if your students on average were not doing a good job with their experimental design, that would jump out for you, and then you could use that information to facilitate a class discussion, say around experimental design issues, or you could ask students to share different designs that they put together in class, both strong and weak. So that stuff will be hopefully coming online shortly, and we'd certainly be glad if people wanted to you know, give it a test drive. Any other questions about the study or about remote labs or simulations in general? Another question from PJ. Well, that is a loaded question. You know, to integrate with our website, and we have folks from different universities. Stanford's coming online hopefully later in 2015. We use the software developed by MIT called the iLab Shared Architecture. Other people use just sort of simple serial controllers. And I think the most common off-the-shelf tool is National Instruments LabVIEW software. So those are the ones that I see. Yeah, you use LabVIEW. Yeah, so that's a pretty common one and is often used, in fact, to connect some remote lab software as well. Yeah, the question, it looks like the questions are only showing up for the moderators, so I apologize to the other folks who can't see anybody else typing, but we can see it. There's something about the chat room that is sort of supervised, and we don't know how to turn off supervision.
Right.
So, yeah, you guys are being supervised, if you didn't know that.
I thought I had given permissions for everybody to use the chat room, so I'm not quite sure.
Well, everyone can chat, they just can't see it. So, but we can see it.
Okay, I got it.
Yeah. Anyway, thanks for the questions, PJ. I appreciate that. Anybody else with any other questions? And I'll try to repeat the questions if people can't see them.
Ron looks like he's having a pretty bad time trying to get in and out. So, Ron, if you are with us and you can hear me, I am recording this, and so I'll send you a link when I've uploaded it to the website, and you should be able to watch and listen, hopefully without any issues. Okay. Do we have any more questions? We've got a few minutes left. Okay, Ron, I see that your connection keeps dropping out, so I apologize for that. I'm not quite sure why that would be happening, but I will send you the link to the webinar recording. Well, Kemi, it looks like we've had kind of a small group, but a very interested one, I know. And I think the information that you shared with us today is very applicable to what we're working on. And I think if anyone thinks of anything that they would like to ask Kemi after the webinar is over, please email me. I'm at jallen@witchy.com. I'll add that to the chat room. And I will forward those on to Kemi. I'm sure he won't have any problems forwarding on messages. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Kemi.
My pleasure.
Very, very much appreciate your time with us and sharing the information on these studies. So it's very, very good.
Good.
Awesome. Okay. Looks like people are starting to sign off. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us. please do get in touch if you need anything or if you'd like to have any questions answered. And big thank you to Kemi.
Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.